In the previous lessons, we learned a little about the history of CSS and how it works. We studied CSS properties, values, and rules, but we only briefly mentioned selectors. Now we're going to cover the selectors in detail. There are 4 different basic selectors: type selectors, class selectors, ID selectors, and attribute selectors. In later lessons, we'll see that we can use different combinations of these selectors together, but for now we're going to learn them one at a time. The type selector matches all elements of a given name in an HTML document. It's pretty simple and can be used with any element. Flip over to Replit and let's try it out. Go ahead and make a new REPL. You can call it whatever you'd like, but I'm going to call this one Basic Selectors. Click the Create button, and then once it's loaded, delete the script.js file. After that, delete everything inside the style.css file and the index.html file so that we're starting completely from scratch. Hit the Run button so that we have a completely blank page in the preview window. Now what? What's the first part of any HTML document? The doc type preamble. Go ahead and add that now. It will be a left arrow, an exclamation point, the word doc type in all uppercase, a space, the word HTML in all lowercase, and then a right arrow. Now what else is required in our HTML document? The HTML element. It's our root level element, the one that literally has the text H, T, M, and L inside of it. Go ahead and make that now. Inside of the HTML element, there are 2 more required elements, and they must be in a specific order. Do you remember what they are? The head element and the body element. Go ahead and make those now. That's it for the required elements. Now we want to test out the type selector. To do that, we'll need an element in the body that we can use with the type selector. Let's go ahead and add an H1 element in the body. You can use whatever text you'd like inside of the H1 element. I'm going to use the text My Personal Blog. We can pretend that this is a personal blog that we're styling throughout the rest of the lesson. Now hit the Run button and you should see your text appear on the page of the preview window. Nice work, but it's unstyled. What would you do if I wanted to make the H1 element have orange text? There's 2 things we need to do. You can pause now to try and figure it out on your own, or keep watching and we'll go over it together. The first thing that we need to do is create our CSS rule in our CSS file. So click on your CSS file and let's create this rule. Do you remember the different parts of a CSS rule? First we need the selector. In this case we're using the type selector. So go ahead and write an H and then a 1 for the H1 element. After that we will always need a pair of curly brackets. What goes inside those curly brackets? All of our CSS declarations. In this case I asked you to set the color of the H1 element text to orange, so let's do that now. Declarations consist of a property and a value, so our property is going to be the word color, then a colon, and then our value is going to be orange. Finally, finish that off with a semicolon. What happens if we click the Run button now? Well, try it and you'll see. Nothing happens. Why is that? Because we didn't link our style sheet to our HTML document. Remember, the HTML document is very dumb. It has no idea which styles to use unless we explicitly link them to the document. So click on our index.html file and let's add a link element to connect our style sheet to our HTML document. Pop quiz. Does the link element go in the head or the body? The head. So let's add that now. The link element is a void element, so it won't need a closing tag, but we also need 2 different attributes. Those attributes are the href attribute, which should have a value of style.css, and the rel attribute, which should have a value of style sheet. Press the Run button and see what happens. Nice work! We've successfully used the type selector in a CSS rule to make our H1 element orange. Let's move on. Okay, to learn about class selectors, we first need to go over class attributes. Class attributes are global attributes, meaning that any element can have a class attribute. The class attribute is used primarily for styling purposes, although later on we'll see that it has some uses with JavaScript as well. You can put whatever you want as the value of your class attribute and use the class selector to find that element and style it. The class selector starts with a dot and then is followed by the class name, which is the value of whatever you wrote in your class attribute. This selector will match all elements that have a class attribute with that class name. Can you think of a reason that this might be useful? What if we had many different paragraph elements on a page, but we only wanted to style a few of them? We can't use the type selector because we don't want to style all of them at once, but we also don't want to write out the styles for each one individually. This would be the perfect time to use a class selector. One last thing to note about classes. If you want to add more than one class to the same element, put it inside the class attribute's value and separate it from the previous one with a space. And yes, this means that class names that you choose should never have a space in them because they will actually be treated as two different classes. Here's an example of how you might use multiple classes on the same element. We're styling most of our paragraphs to be a dark gray color, but we also make the last one italicized. Switch over to Replit and let's try creating classes together. Okay, this one is going to be fairly straightforward. Let's add an H2 element inside of the body of our document beneath the H1. Inside the H2, I'm going to write my first blog post. After that, let's add a paragraph element with the text, "Dear Diary, today was a very tough day. My cat was eaten by an alligator and my grandmother was hit by a bus." Hit the Run button, and we'll see it appear in the preview window. Let's try to make the color of our paragraph gray. You can pause here and try it on your own if you want, or keep watching and we'll do it together. To style with classes, we first need to add a class attribute to whichever element we want to style. Let's add a class attribute to our paragraph element with the value of post-description. Notice that I'm using a dash character instead of a space. Remember, this is because using a space creates two different classes. We don't want to accidentally create two different classes, so stick with the dashes if you're using longer class names. Now flip over to your CSS file, and let's create a CSS rule using the class selector. Do you remember how the class selector starts? It always starts with a dot, or the period character, whatever you'd like to call that symbol. Then we need our class name, which is post-description. After that, a pair of curly brackets, and all of our CSS declarations will go inside there. The only declaration we need for now is color, colon, gray, and don't forget to end it with a semicolon. Press the Run button, and it works. Nice job. On to the next one. Our next selector is the ID selector, which always starts with a hashtag. The ID selector matches an element that has an ID attribute with a specific value. That value is what you write after the hashtag of the ID selector. Like the class attribute, the ID attribute is a global attribute, meaning that it works on any element. ID attributes are required to be unique, although if you accidentally have duplicate IDs in your HTML document, everything won't automatically break. You might get unexpected behavior though, and it will probably hurt your search engine ranking, so try to make sure you don't have duplicate IDs. Switch over to Replit and let's try it out. Okay, so we usually only use IDs for things that will be unique on a web page, meaning that there will only ever be one of them. In this case, I think we can safely say that the blog post titles are unique. Most people usually don't have identical or duplicate posts on their blog, so let's use an ID attribute on the H2 element, which is the title of our blog post. Add an ID to the H2 element and set the value to first-post. Now let's try to make the text inside the H2 red. You're welcome to pause the video here and try it on your own, or keep watching and we'll do it together. Flip over to your CSS file and let's create the CSS rule. Beneath our other rules, create a hashtag. Remember, our ID selectors always start with a hashtag and our class selectors always start with a dot. After the hashtag, write the value of our ID, which is first-post, and then a pair of curly brackets. Inside of there, write color, colon, red, and finish it with a semicolon. Hit the Run button and see what happened. Nice work. Let's move on. Our final selector is the attribute selector. The attribute selector allows you to match and style based on any attribute. For example, we could change the color of all anchor elements to pink if they have an href attribute that links to google.com. The attribute selector is always a pair of square brackets with the attribute name and value inside of them that you want to match. Let's go ahead and try it out in Replit. In our HTML file and beneath our paragraph element, go ahead and add an anchor element with the text "Read More." Because this isn't a real blog, we don't have any other posts to link to right now, so for the href attribute, let's link to Google. Go ahead and add the href attribute now with a value of https://google.com. Hit the Run button and we should see it appear on the page. Now let's try and style this anchor element using the attribute selector. Our challenge is to make the text pink. You can pause now and try it on your own, or continue watching and we'll do it together. Flip over to your CSS file and let's create a new CSS rule beneath all of our other rules. Unlike the ID selector, which starts with a hashtag, and the class selector, which starts with a dot, the attribute selector uses square brackets. And it's not just one square bracket, but a pair of them. So go ahead and type out a pair of left and right square brackets. Inside of those square brackets, we need to put our attribute name and value. In this case, it's href as the name, and then an equal sign, and then https://google.com as the value. After the closing square bracket, put a pair of curly brackets. Inside those curly brackets, we need to write our CSS declaration. In this case, it's color, pink, and don't forget the semicolon at the end. Hit the Run button, and we'll see that our anchor element is now pink. Nice work. And to prove that this really only applies to that specific anchor element, flip back over to our HTML file. Beneath the first anchor element, add a second one, this time with the text "Go to Facebook." Add the href attribute with a value of https://facebook.com and then hit the Run button. Now we see that only our Google link is pink because the attribute selector is matching that attribute exactly and not all href attributes. One last quick note about attribute selectors. You can partially match attributes with the attribute selector. There's a whole set of rules that you can read about on your own time to learn to do that. It isn't super common, so we aren't going to be spending any time on it in this course, but it's good to know that it exists. Finally, if we want to apply the exact same style to multiple different selectors, we can use a selector list. A selector list is a comma-separated list of selectors, followed by our regular curly brackets and CSS declarations. This allows us to avoid copy-pasting styles. Instead, we can just make one rule and put all the selectors in a selector list. Putting them on a single line or multiple lines is fine. And that's it for this lesson on basic selectors. Take a break if you need it, and then head on over to the next one.